For years, Ireland has edged out its neighbors in attracting billions of dollars in investments. And it's done so by taxing companies less. So the country's become the ideal European home for American firms like Apple, Google, and Pfizer. Now, Ireland and other so-called tax havens are at risk of losing their competitive edge. G7 nations have endorsed a global minimum corporate tax rate that they say would level the playing field.
Tax evasion will be more difficult for big companies all over the world, and this is a good message for the people of our countries, and especially the big tech giants will have to pay their fair share, and this is also a good success.
That global minimum tax would end the race to the bottom in corporate taxation and ensure fairness for the middle class and working people in the US and around the world.
The US-led plan would have countries charge a minimum rate of 15%. That's higher than the 12.5% in places like Ireland and Greek-administered Cyprus. Washington says the increase would add $500 billion to state coffers over the next decade. Irish Finance Minister Pascal Donohoe has already hit back. In a tweet, he said any agreement will have to meet the demands of small and large countries, developed and developing. And some analysts say the deal may even erode government revenues for some countries.
German export companies, for example, in future will have their revenues largely taxed abroad. So this money will be missing here, even though we will get more money from Amazon, Apple and Microsoft. But I doubt that that will compensate for the losses.
The deal will need the approval of the larger G20 bloc. That group includes China, which rules over the Asian financial hub of Hong Kong. Corporations in the former British territory pay as low as 8.25%. G7 nations say negotiations will be difficult but worth it if it leads to the elimination of tax havens. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
For more on this, Quentin Parrinello joins me from Paris. He's Senior Policy Advisor on Tax and Inequality at Oxfam France. Welcome to the show. Now, Rishi Sunak, the UK Finance Minister, says this is a historic deal, but so far only 7 countries have agreed to it. How difficult do you think it will be to build global consensus on this issue?
I think it's interesting that 7 countries, one of the 7 of the most important countries in terms of economic growth, are agreeing on minimum taxes. And you're absolutely right. This is the beginning of the story. This is not the end. And they need to convince the G20 countries to get online with this. And then after the G20 agrees with it, they need to convince the whole other 139 nations that are part of the OECD negotiations. So as you pointed out, there are a number of countries that are opposed to that minimum tax. But the good news is that the tax is also designed to be applied unilaterally should the pressure of some of the countries that are opposing it is too strong. So should Ireland, for instance, oppose it, unilateral measures could be possible. And that is what the US has announced already. Should the measure be blocked, the US will apply it unilaterally. And there's nothing preventing other countries, France, Germany, Turkey, to actually do the same and apply it unilaterally. Because should we do that and apply unilaterally, the only losers would be the countries not applying the minimum tax themselves.
But Quentin, I mean, critics might argue that this isn't really an overhaul of global taxation. Effectively, all they're doing is reducing their tax rates to a level more comparable to the likes of, let's say, Switzerland or Ireland. So how is this really changing much? Is this really going to change the behavior of large corporations or how they file their returns, their profits, their taxes?
So I think there's a lot of confusion around how the minimum tax works. This is supposed to be an effective tax rate, which means that this is the tax being paid after all the tax cuts, tax incentives are being withdrawn from the nominal tax rates. So if we take Ireland, for instance, they have a 12.5 nominal tax rate, but the effective tax rates paid by multinationals in Ireland is much lower. Now, that being said, Oxfam is among the organizations that say that the deal is not a full overhaul of the tax system and that it should be more ambitious. It's a first step because minimum taxes are useful to tackle tax avoidance by big multinationals, but the rate is still way too low. It should be higher. President Biden suggested a 21% effective tax rate as a first step, and he had to compromise to a 15% level afterwards. And the whole discussion around exemptions has not been tackled yet, because if you agree to a 15% effective level, but you actually allow a number of exemptions, the effective tax rate could be even lower. So this is a first step, but we need to bolster ambition, and we need to make sure that the revenues levied, the revenues yielded by that tax are effectively benefiting all countries, because what the G7 has agreed so far is a system that benefits mostly G7 countries and not other countries.
Right. So to your point, we've heard a lot of discussion about Amazon as a test case, that last year their profit margin was about 6.5% or so, definitely much lower than that 10% threshold. So is this kind of replacing old tax loopholes with just new ones?
So again, there are two segments in the negotiations. There's the minimum tax that would apply to all multinationals and making sure that they pay a certain minimum level of taxes. And there's the segment around taxing rights and making sure that digital giants pay taxes where they have customers. Because so far, you were taking the example of Amazon, Google, or other digital giants. They operate in certain markets and they do not pay taxes. So another segment of the deal that was struck last Sunday is about making sure that a tiny part of taxing right is distributed to market countries. The way it was announced last Saturday is still very blurred, so we don't really understand the details of it, and Amazon could actually be out. But we heard yesterday from Janet Yellen that she supports the fact that Amazon should be in the companies that taxing rights are redistributed to market countries. So there's more to follow at the G20 level and at OECD level on that part. But just to make one thing clear, the segment on digital giants is likely to shift hundreds of millions of dollars maximum to a number of countries. The minimum tax is likely to yield billions or tens or hundreds of billions of dollars more in states' coffers. So this is a much more ambitious and much more transformative measure, should the rate be high enough, right? And at the time where we're actually considering how to pay the bill for the coronavirus, that is actually a very good answer to look for the money that is stashed in tax havens.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your analysis, Quentin Parrinello there from Oxfam France.